Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. Let's face it, many parents are not 100% happy with what schools are offering their students. Some feel that schools could be more personal. Others feel that the academics aren't as strong as they would like. So it's not surprising to see the rise of the micro school movement. I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about what micro schools are, but I'm really excited to have David Richards joining us. David is the CEO of Changemaker, which is a organization that promotes the development of micro schools. He is also the host creator of Changemaker EDU, where he talks about micro schools and their evolution onto the education scene. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, John. I'm excited to be here.
Glad to always speak with people who are innovators in the education space. And really, because my podcast's purpose is to talk about what does 21st century education look like? And clearly micro schools are an aspect of that. So David, before we even start talking about micro schools, can you tell us your evolution? How did this become an area of interest for you? And then, yes, if you can give us almost like a definition of what micro schools are.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I think it started when I was a kid. My own K through 12 education experience was so not personalized that I think that's part of the driver for me to be so passionate about micro schools now, because I probably went through my K through 12 education without one teacher ever really getting to know me, if you don't count like maybe my basketball coach, right? And so I felt like the classroom could have been so much more personalized and so much more relationship based. And so for me, I started as a banker turned educator turned entrepreneur. So I left my corporate banking job in Washington, D.C., and became a teacher in Oakland Public School. So I went from corporate banking, three-piece suit, to urban high school with teenagers all in a matter of like a year. That was a massive transition, but I fell in love with the kids and I felt like those relationships were so key. And when I was in Oakland, I have like 185 kids. And I felt like they were all struggling, a lot of mental health issues, a lot of, sort of like poverty kind of things going on. And so I just felt like I was putting my finger on the dam. And I literally had this thought before I left where I was like, I have to choose like a few of them. Like I have to choose a few kids to help because I can't help all 180. And so that's when I found the charter space and I found public schools. And the pitch there was like, we're building small, personalized, relationship-based schools where you're a high school teacher with 25 kids in a class and 4 sections with 100 total. And you're going to spend 4 years with them looping, and it's going to be really personalized. And so after helping build Summit Public Schools and going from teacher to principal to assistant superintendent, I decided I was ready to launch my own school, and I launched a K-8 that my own kids attended. And it was really meaningful, again, to get that small school feel and that personalized attention. And so it almost makes perfect logical sense that my next project would be micro schools, because I've always been such a huge fan of these small, intimate learning environments.
I love that. And you already started talking about some of the benefits of micro school in terms of the personalization that it can provide students. But can you walk us through some of the other benefits of going to a micro school? And also, how would you define a micro school
Oh, yeah.
in terms of the number of students?
Yes. So a micro school is very simple. It's based on the number of students. So anywhere from 5 to 175 students is considered a micro school. And this is based on the National Microschooling Center, which I've had the director, Don Soifer, on my podcast. And he actually came on right when they released their annual report to share all the data about how many micro schools there are in the country, what percentage this and that, and all the really great data. So you can check that out on their website. But yeah, it's just basically the size of the micro school. And then 80% are privately funded through tuition. And a lot of that is offset by education savings accounts or vouchers. So there's an opportunity to be able to serve a lot of different types of families, depending on the state you're in. And then the other 20%, 10% of them are public charter schools, and the other 10% are district schools that are running micro schools. And I think you'll see the numbers increase around public charters and district schools running micro schools in the future. And then your other question was, what are some of the benefits of micro schools? Yeah, I think it's the obvious benefit. The obvious trade-off is it's small. You're not going to have a football team. You're not going to have, a huge dance, those kind of things. Like those are the trade-offs. But the benefits of having small learning environments. I have friends that run micro schools. This is why I got really into it. It's like the kid comes in first grade, he's already been labeled as ADHD, right? He feels bad about himself. He's crying every day. He can't fit into the traditional school model, right? With 38 kids in a class or whatever. And the teacher's doing their best, but they can't seem to deal with this kid. And so every day, mom's getting a phone call. This kid's bad. This kid's bad. This kid's bad. Then they go to this micro school that my friend runs in rural South Dakota. And she's like, okay, we're going to get to know this kid. And there's only 4 first graders. It's multi-age classrooms. There's only actually 14 kids in the class. 4 of them are in first grade. We're going to get to know this kid. It's a redux of the one-room schoolhouse. We're going to really figure out what makes him tick. We're going to spend a lot of time outside. We're going to meet him where he's at academically and developmentally. And within, 6 months now on the front of her website is a testimonial from this family that literally says, every day my son came home feeling like he was a bad kid. And now he feels like he can be creative and he can do what he's always doing in his life. So that's the power of a small micro school.
I love that. Years ago, I worked in a magnet school that was very small. So it almost in a way was a micro school. And
Yes.
what I found was because I taught the students all 4 years of high school, it was a high school micro school.
Yep.
And I was really able to form very strong relationships with those students, some of which continue to this day now that those students are adults. So I totally understand from a personal perspective just how strong and important those connections. It really puts the community in community schools, if you will. David, would you say most of the micro schools are elementary schools, or do we also see a rise in the number of micro high schools?
Yeah, you're seeing a lot more. Again, it's all in the report, which is great. I'm so thankful that they put this report together. But you're seeing a lot more younger ages, like elementary and middle school, than you are seeing high school. I don't remember the exact specifics, but I want to say 75, 25, like 25% high school. But the high school numbers are starting to increase. But it kind of makes sense because you think about if you're running a micro school, and again, like I said, what's the best part of a big traditional high school? It's the extracurriculars, right? Like you get to be in the play, you get to do football, like you can find your space. Whereas in a small micro high school, you're not going to get that social and the extracurricular. So, and then you add on like college requirements and accreditation and all these things that small micro schools are like, we don't have the resources to figure out. But that said, I think as we get more mature as a movement, more and more high schools are starting to open and kind of figuring out the ways around it. Like, you can apply to college as a homeschool learner through a micro school. And then that way your micro school doesn't have to be accredited for college, right? So they're sort of figuring out ways to ensure that they meet the requirements and do its best for the students. But yeah, high school is a little bit slower in terms of the micro schools movement.
But I'm glad you answered that because in answering it, you helped me to form my next question, which
Oh, great.
is you were talking about some of the trade-offs as well in going to a micro school, particularly that engagement in those larger school activities, the prom, the play. And that definitely could be an issue in a small school. Like when in the small schools I worked in, we formed a relationship with some of the other high schools. Our
Right.
students could participate on those teams, but
Yeah.
still have the individual support and small, close community by going to our micro school. So that's one way we worked around it. Could you tell us one aspect or one way to get around some of the limitations. I think you were saying, and I could
The
actually
homeschool.
repeat what you were saying.
Yeah, no problem. I was saying that you can apply as a homeschool learner to college if you go to a micro school. So some micro schools will choose to operate as a homeschool learning center, which means the parents are taking responsibility for compulsory education and they're registering with the state as a homeschool family. And the micro school's acting as a vendor to provide the instruction and curriculum. So if you're doing that for a high school, then your individual child can now apply to fill in the blank. Like my niece is super bright and she went to Stanford University as a homeschool student. So now universities have a sort of set aside for homeschoolers that they will, so that's a creative way that micro schools are finding ways around some of the larger institutional challenges that you have to deal with as a micro school.
Got it. And then in terms of it being considered a homeschool, does that also help students if they want to participate in events? How do they participate in those larger events if the micro school cannot provide those directly?
Yeah, it's the same thing as you were talking about. It's if you're a homeschool family, then most of the times the district will have a relationship where they're allowing you to participate in the events, or the micro school will create a partnership. So I think there's just creative ways to do that. And one of the things I wanted to mention around high school that I think is really interesting is, 75% of high school students do not like high school. That's the poll that, we've heard. And so there's a huge space and a huge need for those kids that want to. My son came home, he's 14, he's going into ninth grade at a comprehensive high school, but he came home and he said, Dad, there's a seventh grader that's making a lot of money. And I said, what is he doing? And he said, he's designing some sort of like really cool shoe and then he's selling it online and he's making like thousands of dollars and all the kids are talking about it. And so that type of kid now is going to walk into a comprehensive high school with 4,000 students where he's supposed to sit still for 6 hours, 55 minutes at a time and listen to a teacher talk at him about world history and he's sitting back and looking at his phone and there's thousands of dollars coming in. He's not going to last. So I think there's going to be a whole space for those YouTubers, those gamers, this kind of gig economy where they're going to want like a hybrid model where they can go to school and do online learning at their own pace and then they can go and do their business and they can do multiple different things. So I think you're going to see a lot of different hybrid micro schools coming up that allow for that sort of high school age kid that can have tons of autonomy and freedom. And they don't want to be just like adults. We want the flexibility and the freedom. So I think that's going to start happening with micro high schools.
So speaking about the innovations that come about through micro schools, can you walk us through your micro school and what it does? Because one thing I would love to loop back and talk about, you were also talking about spiraling and,
Mhm.
teachers working with students, which I think could actually be a benefit because you get to
Yeah.
really know the students. You already mentioned that as one aspect of
Yeah.
your micro schools, but walk us through your micro school if you don't
Well,
mind.
so what's fascinating about our micro schools is that we actually have a program for affiliate founders. What that means is you're representing the Changemaker Micro Schools brand, but every one is unique and different. So the way we've created this whole situation, this whole organization is if you're a founder and we have a group in Philadelphia, we have a group in Houston, we have a group in Atlanta. So everyone's going to need something different. If you're in a rural or urban area, you're going to need something different and you're going to know your community best. So our vision for this, our request and our requirement is that you are values aligned with us. And so if you go to our website, changemakereducation.com, you'll see that we talk about shifting the paradigm and reimagining education. So we ask that you are in favor of self-directed learning. We ask that you're in favor of experiential or project-based learning. And we ask that you're in favor of social emotional learning or some sort of emotional intelligence training and leadership development. And so if you are willing to do those philosophically and your values aligned with us, then you have to go through our interview process to be selected into our program. But if you are values aligned, then you can bring whatever you want in. So to answer your question specifically, we have a school in Philadelphia that's arts based and they're doing performing arts and they're in the middle of the city. We have a school in Atlanta that's doing dance and music. We have one in Houston that's for younger kids and it's all about social emotional learning and like just getting kids to really understand their feelings. And then we have one in Chicago that's a middle school that's all about STEAM. And then they're doing an international trip. It's a global education in STEAM. And so she wants to take them to Costa Rica at the end of the year. South Carolina is all about meditation and how to use meditation and science to come together and learn your body and neuroscience. So they're all a little bit different, but they all have similarities around, most of them are multi-age. So it's not, we're throwing out the old grade levels, factory model, first grade, second grade. It's like, let's get a group of kids together, figure out what they need, and put the ages together and make it more of like a community rather than kind of separated by age. So that's a sampling of what our micro schools are doing. And we're actually recruiting another 15 founders to open micro schools in the fall of 2026. We already have some really fascinating founders coming in that have an amazing vision to build this model of the future of education.
Are
Yeah.
they also going to be the teacher or teachers? How do you recruit teachers and pay for them?
Yeah, so we have a mix of some folks are, they were principal for 5 to 7 years. We have some district leaders that are now ready to go back and be in the classroom. But for the most part, the first couple years, once a micro school opens and you have your budget running, then you can decide, do you want to hire a teacher? Do you want to do it by yourself? And it really comes down to the number of students. So some of our founders have decided, I want to do 14 students and I want to be the teacher, and it's me and a couple volunteers. I want to have like 28 students and still 14-to-1 ratio. So I'm only teaching half the day. So everyone's kind of making different choices. And again, some of them, our founder in Chicago, she's out of the classroom, 2 years ago or something. So she's really happy to be teaching. And then we have another founder who hasn't taught for 15 years. And so it's a different kind of appetite based on where they are in their career. But all of them are very involved and on the ground in the school to make sure that the values are there.
And I think you were saying before that in some states or in some locations, the voucher funds can help fund this program, correct?
Absolutely. So what I was saying before is that majority of micro schools today are private tuition, so funded by parents paying. However, if you're in most of the southern states, you're going to get some sort of offset of the tuition based on the voucher or the education savings account or an educational tax credit. So for example, we have a founder in Houston, and Texas just passed a very controversial law that families can access up to $10,000 per child to utilize towards a private school. If you're a micro school, you have to register with the state, follow all their rules, and now the families can use $10,000 towards a micro school tuition. If the micro school is charging $10,000 a year, you now just are paying nothing. Now, if you go to other states like Atlanta, we have one in Georgia, they have something called the Georgia Promise Scholarship, $6,500 per child. And so you're offsetting the tuition. So if you're charging $10,000, then the family is paying the other $3,500.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
What would you say, or can you describe the characteristics of some of your founders coming into this program?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a very diverse group in terms of racial and ethnic background and also in terms of experience. But I would say the thing that really brings them together that keeps them similar is they are all very committed to the social emotional learning piece, because that's like the through line for all of us. But I also think they're the educator that is tired of the traditional system. And they really are so tired of it that they're willing to take this massive risk of launching their own entity, which is, even though we help you, it's still a risk. And they're willing to make some sacrifices to get this off the ground and to create their own small micro school and really go down this entrepreneurial path. So it's like this hunger for change, for wanting to be part of the solution, but also just being so tired of a system that hasn't valued them, hasn't valued the students they serve. And they're just at a tipping point where they're like, we're done and we want to go do our own thing. And we're really ready to be an entrepreneur and to really figure out how to make this work on our own. So I'd say that's the most common characteristic, but none of them are like rich or, just normal people like you and me, educators that want to make a difference and that are looking for support to try and do it so they don't have to do it on their own.
I love that. And I love that there are people willing to bring forth innovation in education. Like you said, PBL focus, SEL focus, because the more schools, and I'm preaching to the choir, obviously, the more schools that we do have doing that, even if a student isn't going to a micro school, if there is a micro school that is getting successful student achievement results by being innovative, those same processes, projects, innovative ways of teaching can be replicated back in the traditional district schools. Have you, and speaking of that, let's talk about that for a moment. Do your schools have any partnership with traditional schools in that regard?
No, we don't, but we'd really love to have that. And we're actually seeing, I have some founders that have reached out to me that are applying for next year's cohort that are working with, going to districts and making proposals. There's a great example of a district in rural Indiana. I don't remember the exact location, but one of my friends connected me. I do remember, I think his name's George Philhauer, the superintendent, but he's seeing micro schools as like a real amazing opportunity. And so he's creating a collective of micro schools across rural Indiana, and somehow he's figured out a way to do it like under the auspices of his district. So it's like a win-win for everybody. So it's publicly funded, scaling micro schools, it's open to everyone, and he's gotten a lot of attention for that. And I think it's a really innovative, great idea. And so I think you see that happening so quickly, like a innovative district leader now coming up with a great program. And I think you'll see a lot of district leaders saying, my friend who runs Purdue Polytechnic out in Indianapolis, Indiana, he started a micro school for the kids that were really struggling in his charter school, this create the smaller group sizes. And I think you'll start seeing a lot of those types of innovations that are being spurred on by parents coming and saying like, wow, this micro school is changing my life. And my kids, accelerated 2 grade levels. It's just smaller class sizes and like a lot of attention and really strong teaching. And all of a sudden my kid's just thriving. And I think that's going to really press on when the parents start going to the district and saying like, I'm not putting up with 38 kids in a classroom. Like there's a micro school down the street where there's only 14 or 8. I think we're like 8-1, like smaller group. And, and the districts are going to have to start, and the charters are going to have to responding.
And, as you were talking, David, I was thinking, we're talking about a lot of the benefits of micro schools, which truly there are. And especially in a political environment where we do see more public funds helping parents to fund this. Because let's face it, rich people or middle class people have always had educational choice options.
Yeah.
Student teachers and families in the inner city, less so. So
Yep.
this can really help to equalize or provide equity when it comes to choice. So that's a good thing. Let's talk about some of the things, though, that can go wrong. Because you even mentioned there is a risk when you open up a micro school. Can you walk us through what some of those risks are and how you coach founders through those potential icebergs?
Yeah. So a couple of things. Number one of the reasons I wanted to create this organization is because I wanted a really responsible, high integrity person like myself and the people that I attract and hire to be doing this so that we could ensure that we have somebody saying like, I know what's going on over there. It's kind of like the charter space that I was in. It's like, I know what's going on over there, but that's not what we're doing. My friends would ask me at parties like, well, I hear they do this and that. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. Just like any industry, there's bad actors. However, here's what we do at mine. And they're like, oh, that's amazing. So yeah, I think the risk with opening is like any new entity, right? Like you're talking about trying to get something off the ground, convince a family to enroll in like an old bank building or a church classroom, and it's not a traditional space, so it's risky for the family. And you're trying to convince them to pay tuition, and now you're trying to figure out how to make this work with maybe only 14 kids. That means there's only one teacher. What happens when the teacher gets sick? Like there's all these trade-offs of these small schools in addition to the benefits. And then I think the other issue that the micro schools movement is facing is a little bit of a sustainability issue, in that there's so much passion in the beginning, there's so much passion and energy, but they're not really being as thoughtful as I would like them to be around, are these sustainable organizations? So I've heard people say to me like, okay, homeschool mom has 3 of her own kids, and then everyone's like, you're so good, why don't you add some more? So then she adds 3 more. Now she has 6 kids in her living room. That's considered a micro school. She's tired after 3 years. She's like, well, one of my kids graduated. I don't really want to deal with these other kids. So they close it down. Or she moves to another space and she gets 15 kids and then she closes down. Or they don't really charge that much. Like, let's say they open one in Atlanta and they're like, well, I'm going to charge 6,500 because that's what the state gives them. Well, it costs 10,000 per student to run the organization. And then they get some grants. And then by year 3, they're like, this is too tiring. I'm always raising money. I can't change my tuition. And then they just close down. So I think there's a risk of a sustainability issue. And that's why we're really clear for our founders. When you come in with us, we're building something that's going to last and it's going to be sustainable. And we're not kind of playing around and being silly and just, this is a very serious endeavor because we're talking about children and families and children's lives. So we got to be really, really serious, and we got to have clear budget models, and we got to get the business side right. And a lot of educators, no fault of their own, don't understand the business side. But as a former banker, I spent all my 20s in business, and my dad's a small business owner. So I'm happy to teach them that. And you run a great micro school and I'll teach you all the ways to make sure you keep it open and have the right insurance and the right budget models and, get a good facility and all that. It's still a risky endeavor.
And I'm glad that you were open and honest about that because, yes, it is about sustainability. Because, yeah, I can understand someone getting tired and wanting not to do it anymore. David, what about the families that have trusted you, their children? Now
Yeah.
they have to go find another option, perhaps before they were ready. And that isn't really fair to the families that we brought on or you brought on in this journey. And I know that the focus of this podcast is not to go over all the ways to make a micro school sustainable. But would
Yeah.
you mind sharing one or two big aha ideas that you've learned that make micro schools sustainable?
Yeah. I honestly think the root issue is the business side. So I will get this phone call regularly. So I'm looking for founders who want to open a new micro school. And what I'll get is someone at LinkedIn saying, I already have a micro school and I'm really wondering if I could be part of your cohort and you could help me. But they're essentially saying, could you help me save my micro school? And so what I typically do is say, let's get on the phone. And then what they say is, I charged $5,000 a year. I don't know any school in America that run on a per pupil funding of $5,000 per year, especially when you only have 10 kids, right? So that's $50,000 with 10 kids. So you're not paying yourself. You're partnering with the church and you're getting a couple $100s a month, but that's not long term. To answer your question, what I'm seeing as the couple issues is just not having a good long term business plan that allows you to sustain yourself past like 3 to 5 years. So not charging enough tuition, maybe signing like a long-term lease that is way too expensive, or not, having a good board of directors that's going to kind of hold you accountable. So I think it's those types of pieces. And I think it's no fault of the educator, because I'll meet an educator who says, I want to start a micro school and I want every kid to attend. And I'll say, what state are you in? And they'll say Kentucky. And I'll say, what's the education savings account landscape? Well, we don't have them. Okay, so how much are you going to charge? Well, I'm thinking of charging 8,000. Okay, that's going to be tough. And I'm like, okay, so now you've given away, well, I told this family I only have to pay 5,000. So it's all coming from our heart, but it's not sustainable from an economic standpoint. And that's what's getting the micro schools.
You
Yeah.
were mentioning the small school community being a plus for the
Yeah.
kids. Clearly it is. How, though, do the educators get that connection or find that connection with other educators when they're so isolated? Because there is a benefit to learning new strategies, receiving professional development. What does that look like in a micro school so educators don't feel so alone and isolated?
I think it's a real problem. And I think it's one that our vision to solve it is that we have actual regional hubs. So if we have 5 in Texas, that hopefully they're all within, an hour of each other, and that we actually facilitate gatherings for them to get together so that they meet each other in person. And then they also now have a collaboration that they can do on Zoom or on phone calls. But yeah, I think it's a problem because it's a small school, right? And so I think the best case scenario is, I know some micro schools have 7 teachers or 7 adults, and they find ways to collaborate. But again, it's a small school trade-off, right? It's a small school problem. Is that you don't have. When I was teaching at the Summit Charter School I mentioned, we had one 10th grade history teacher, and I never had anyone to collaborate with for 10th grade history. And then when we opened a second school, I was like, this is amazing. Now I have somebody I can email and be like, what did you do when all of them failed this? Or how did you deal with that? But I think the other thing, to your point around districts and stuff, is like, I would love to see more communities of practice in general. Like if you have a small micro school, why can't we collaborate with just teachers in general and create more spaces for hubs for teachers to collaborate regardless of which school they work for?
Indeed. And then the follow-up question to that, David, is what do the local education agencies or authorities where these micro schools are, how do you ensure ongoing quality of the instructional program?
She went and visited some really great ones now, so she doesn't believe that's the only type of micro school. I think there's a risk of, if you're taking the education savings account money, there is a lot more kind of oversight from the state. But I think there's a risk of kind of this homeschool community that's like, I'm starting a micro school, and maybe they don't have the quality that we would like. Maybe the kids feel really good when they go home and they're happy, like they got the culture down, but they're not actually really holding high expectations for academic achievement. And so I think that's a risk. And I think that's why, just like charters in the early days, we have to create more accountability measures and figure out ways to make sure that the people that aren't operating with high quality are actually, there's some sort of consequences from these local agencies without overreach and too much, regulatory and red tape and all that. But just the baseline, like the education savings accounts will usually make you do one standardized test, like a norm reference test, just to show the state education department that kids are actually learning something. So I think those types of accountability measures are really needed and welcomed. Yeah. So for us, one of the reasons that we are looking to find mainly educators that are doing this is so that we can maintain quality through a highly trained educator. That's one piece. And then the other piece is we're not against standardized tests, but we're also not huge fans of 3 weeks of 5 hours a day of tests like you see in some traditional schools. So our approach is that we will use a norm reference like NWA MAP or some other type of norm reference test to really validate what our great teachers are doing on the ground. It's like, okay, so you think this kid's doing this and you think they're doing really well in this. Let's now do the norm reference test so we can share it with our families and say, wow, like this kid's advanced. Oh, that kid's not doing very well. And really hold ourselves accountable. So that's our plan to really ensure that we're meeting those standards. I don't want to go too far in a direction of too many standardized tests and, kind of getting into this place where it's not very effective or good for kids and families and teachers because you're doing so much testing. But I think once a year would be really reasonable. Maybe like a fall map and then a June end of year map would be really smart. And then our teachers could utilize the data. And so that's what we're planning to do in our schools to ensure that we have some metrics for success.
And what has been most surprising to you, David, on this journey?
Here's the most surprising thing I did not think was going to be so drastic. I thought we would be adding so much value around the community and the connection and the collaboration for these aspiring founders. They come into our community, they get all the business support, they get all this like really great coaching from myself and our other team members. That was true. But what I did not realize is this transition from educator to entrepreneur is massive. It's massive. So in the first couple weeks, because we've had one cohort now, I was like, wow, I think I need to do a talk every single time we meet about entrepreneurial mindset. And so, we started saying things like you need to make flexible decisions. It's nonlinear thinking. It's, a lot of just changing direction one day to the next. Like you thought that was going to happen. Now this has happened because it's a brand new entity and you're on this entrepreneurial path. So that was the most surprising to me. And again, it's just because if you think about the education space, when are you ever taught to think like an entrepreneur? Probably never, unless there's unique examples. But for the most part, you're taught to think about like following rules and doing what the district says and then doing what your principal says and then dotting your I's, crossing your T's. So that was shocking to me because I've always been very entrepreneurial. And I was like, okay, this is probably the number one thing we're adding is helping people go from black and white rule follower educator to bold, innovative entrepreneur.
Mhm. And it's funny you mentioned that. I'm chuckling over here because when I worked in the micro schools, I was definitely doing some things that the traditional school that we were partnered with was not necessarily doing. And definitely a lot of people were rolling their eyes. But my students still come back to me and say that they not only learn something, but they do remember
That's amazing.
because we weren't as constrained. I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, I brought in a lot of speakers, a lot of community partners to be working with their students in Model UN and mock trial and
Yeah.
forensic investigations, and also some controversial speakers coming in and talking both sides of an issue and
Yeah.
training my students how to facilitate that and how much fun it was for them and actually fun for me as an educator to be innovative and not just doing the same thing the same
Yes.
way every day. Where, like you're saying, there's a point to accountability,
Mhm.
there's a reason for testing and assessment,
Yeah.
there's a reason to have learning goals, but there is the flip side of that. Is there anything that we haven't talked about about micro schools that in terms of this innovation or entrepreneurial spirit,
Yeah.
I would imagine one of the areas educators might struggle in is in this almost like a return to a one room schoolhouse in a way
Yep.
where it isn't separated by grades and you are teaching all your students at once through a project or by leveling that. That I'm sure is a huge shift for many, many, many educators. How have you walked people through that in terms of developing their instruction where they are teaching a mixed group of students, literally and truly?
Exactly. Well, here's the good news. I have been actually doing this since 2010 when I was the principal of the third summit school, where we literally in July tore down the walls and decided we would do an open concept, make it all about personalized and self-directed learning. So the current summit model that's in 300 schools across the country, we developed when we blew up the walls, literally tore down the walls in July, and the kids were coming 3 weeks later. And so the biggest challenge with transitioning the summit model was the teacher mindset. I want to be in control. I don't want to let them be in control, which is what most of us want as teachers. So self-directed learning is the opposite, right? So talk to a Montessori teacher, they're not in control. The kids navigating the different spaces in the Montessori classroom. So I've been working on trying to train educators how to shift their mindset to more self-directed and project-based for, the last 15 years. So that will be a big challenge with the educators we find. However, we do try and find the educators that are ready, like they're ready to become an entrepreneur. They're also ready to take on this challenge of shifting their mindset. And it's so fun to watch them because I catch them when we're in coaching sessions, and they're like, wait, no, 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 that's not a good idea. I'm just trying to control them, and I'm like, oh, this is easy. Like you're already catching it because they're not part of a system where someone's telling them what to do. They're now saying, I want to build a self-directed project-based learning micro school. And so I need you to show me what to do. And so I think that's going to be one of the really exciting things we do when the schools start to open, because our first cohort's opening this fall. And I think that's going to be where we spend a lot of time, like push each other on, well, how did it go today? And how did this kid do? And what'd you do with that? And how were you relinquishing control to ensure that this is like a really self-directed model?
You're segueing right into my next question, David, which is
Yeah.
we were speaking off camera about this new cohort you're starting and that you're seeking applications for this
Yeah.
cohort and you're going to get going in, I think the applications are due in November of
Yeah.
2025.
Mhm.
Walk us through how people could apply if they're interested in being part of your cohort.
Yeah, it's very simple. So you go to our website, changemakereducation.com. There's a button that says apply, and it'll take you to our LinkedIn posting. And you just click on there and you can apply through LinkedIn. If for some reason you don't have LinkedIn, you can just apply via email. But either way, that's all you do. And then basically we reach out to you and put you through our process. And then if you're selected to join the cohort, then you come on in and we get you going.
I love that. Now that I have another podcaster, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. How has Changemaker EDU podcast helped you in creating micro schools?
Oh, no one's asked me that before. And it's such a great question because it was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago when I started getting really curious about micro schools and I started kind of doing a lot of research. And then I launched the podcast 3 years ago. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go reach out to the founder and CEO of KaiPod because they now have 300 micro schools. I'm going to go find my favorite Acton people that I see on LinkedIn and ask them to come on the podcast. So I started interviewing the guy who runs the Socratic Experience is an online high school, and the person who runs Apogee Schools, which is an offshoot of it. So I started interviewing these micro school founders and these innovators, and it was really for my audience. But as you know, it's always for you as the podcast host. You're always learning. And so I got so excited when they started telling me, like, I would just get so excited, right? They'd be like, oh, yeah, so you get these small groups and da, da, da. And I'm like, this is amazing. And I was like, this is so exciting. So I just kept going back to the whiteboard and I kept writing and writing. I thought, something's here. I'm going to work on something. So it literally was the birth of Changemaker Education, which is why I named it the same thing, because it started with the podcast and then it morphed into the actual organization.
I love that. So, David, is there anything we haven't talked about that you want the listeners to know?
Yeah, I would share. I think the thing we didn't mention as much is there's something really amazing about becoming your own founder and your own owner, whether it's a nonprofit owner, or operator, or a business owner. But either way, you're in charge. And one of the things we really believe in is that you should have autonomy. And I think our current education system, whether it's public or private, is all about command and control. There's multiple layers between the superintendent and the teacher at the quote unquote bottom. But we're trying to turn that on its head. Just like we want to do the same thing with the students, we want to do the same thing with our founders. So I'm really excited to meet people that are so passionate about working with kids and they just need a different system. And now they get to be in charge. They get to have the autonomy and they get to choose what they want to do. And if something's not working, you don't have to wait 6 months until the school board changes it. You literally change it by lunch. If you started at 9 o'clock, it's not working. At o'clock, you've already changed it.
Where can people, I mean, you've already talked about Changemaker EDU and the website, but if people did want to reach out to you, yes, they can reach out to you there. What are some of the other ways that they could reach out to you?
I think the only other way is Changemaker EDU on Instagram, but the most common way people reach out to me is via LinkedIn. So just look up Changemaker Education via LinkedIn or just go to David K. Richards on LinkedIn. You can find me and send me a note.
And if they're interested in your podcast, where can they find that?
All the places you'll find podcasts, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, everywhere.
Great. David, this has really been an informative conversation. I'm glad we had it. It really shows or provides that nuance that we're seeing in education, that there is innovation in education, that there are educators out there that are interested in new models of learning, which will lift all boats. So I'm glad that we had this conversation, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.